All right. Hello, guys. Welcome. Today we're going to be discussing Dopamine Nation by Anna Lemke. She's an addiction counselor, doctor, specializing in addiction counseling. This book, particularly, is talking about how we are in an overabundant world of dopamine and how a lot of the times the habits we get into can lead us to just have a very dopamine deficient lifestyle because of all these external ways we're getting it. Part one is about the pursuit of pleasure and how, as a human, you have kind of this innate desire to pursue pleasure. So chapter one, she goes through the whole book, kind of talking about some of her different patients and the things that they've shared with her, and how it kind of relates to her understanding of dopamine. In chapter one, she is talking to this individual who has built this like masturbation machine, basically like these. Found a way to get these electrodes to like stimulate him for hours and hours on end. And she's talking throughout this chapter how, while this is a pretty extreme case of someone really pursuing pleasure in its like most animalistic form, that humans do that with a lot of different things. Hers, the author, was particularly, she started getting into romance books at first, and started reading past her bedtime. And then she kind of caught herself reading when she should be spending time with her kids. And it did kind of form into this addiction and, got a little bit more depraved where she is now moving from romance to erotica books, right? And while that situation is not nearly as extreme as the patient who's literally building this masturbation machine, it was a good personal touch on her kind of own personal experience with pursuing pleasure. One quote that I want to kick off chapter one was scientists rely on dopamine as a kind of universal currency for measuring the addictive potential of any experience. And then persons with severe addictions are among those contemporary prophets that we ignore to our own demise, for they show us who we truly are. That's a pretty interesting quote. I'm coming out of rehab about 3 months ago. I finished it. And the amount of insight you could get from some of these individuals was really impressive and pretty staggering. And it is cool to hear someone like her have that opinion as well. I think it's easy to, look at a particular individual and they've been, homeless for 20 years. Their family doesn't talk to them. They don't make any money. And you build this judgment that there's really nothing I can learn from this person, or there's this kind of superiority complex there. When if you really break down your judgment and you listen to the stories of this person and kind of the experiences where they got caught up in this endless cycle of pursuing pleasure, you find a lot of similarities. And I know at least I did for sure. So let's
Can you say that?
see.
Can you say that quote one more time?
Yes. The quote is scientists rely on dopamine as a universal currency for measuring the addictive potential of any experience. And then a little bit after that, it was persons with severe addictions are among those contemporary prophets that we ignore to our own demise, for they show us who we truly are.
Yeah, I think there's two really good points in there. First, talking about how dopamine is a currency. Later, she talks about this historian, David Courtwright, and he calls it limbic capitalism. The limbic system is kind of what drives dopamine in your brain and kind of a lot of the eat, sleep, sex type things that are kind of natural and innate to humans. And so I like this idea that our world is filled with this limbic capitalism that's trying to capitalize on our dopamine system. They're going to try to create social media that floods you with dopamine so you become addicted and give you foods with sugar in it. Even if the food isn't like a sugary food, like it's hard to get red pasta sauce that doesn't have sugar in it. And the only reason for that is because it becomes more addictive. And so they're really trying to like hammer on that dopamine as in a really capitalistic way. So I really like that. But then I also love the fact that she calls them whatever, like modern day prophets, which I thought was a really profound way of thinking about it. And in this world where we're all now addicted to something in some way and getting flooded with dopamine, that those are the people who've been dealing with dopamine and trying to kind of prevent the deterioration of their life due to it for a long time. And so there's so much wisdom that we can glean from those type of people. And I thought it was a really charitable way of doing it. As you said, I think society has a inappropriately negative view on people who suffer from addiction, and that they don't have wisdom that we can learn. And it seems that it's becoming more and more, the wisdom that they have is becoming more and more useful to the everyday person.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, tying that to just this capitalistic society of everything is getting more and more addictive. That's a great point. As time goes on, with products getting more dopamine rich, food, social media, these people are really good resources to kind of understand. Well, they have experienced this form of addiction, right? So if they were able to go through this kind of process and get over that level, maybe you could take some of what they've done and maybe get through your a little bit more minor addiction, which could be, Instagram every 5 seconds or something like that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I guess
it's
before we
good.
go further, let's define what addiction means. Like, what does addiction mean to you, Caden?
Oh man, addiction is the absolute reliance on something to the point where your morals are jeopardized, your good habits are jeopardized, and everything is so skewed that your scale in terms of pain pleasure, all that matters is that substance or that thing. Ye- Addiction is blindness, I guess, in a sense, where you're not really able to see the pleasure of anything else other than that particular substance. And I think that's what turns it into addiction, right? If this is the only way to get this form of pleasure, then that's all I'm gonna fucking think about. That's all I'm gonna care about. I will steal a car and sell it in order to get a little bit more of this thing, because that's where your only focus is. So yeah, that's how I guess phrase it. I'm sure other people probably have a little bit more educated description, but yeah,
No,
it's your question.
I love that. I think a simple word, it's blindness, or yeah, letting that one thing be the only thing in your vision. I think that's a really easy way of understanding it. She describes it, and this is kind of the clinical definition, but this aligns completely with what you're saying. It's a continued and compulsive consumption of a substance or behavior despite its harm to self and or others. So you're hurting other people and you're blind to it because you're just so focused on that one thing. So I really like that, just blindness.
Totally. There's a piece in this chapter. So she's in more like the psychiatric realm of medicine, right? She has a quote here that I kind of wanted to ask you about. Her quote was I a better doctor when I knew less and felt more? And that's coming from the background of, being a therapist, right? So I think there is like some type of empathy and emotions and caring about a particular patient more and maybe being more naive to the actual medicine. Maybe that's helpful. But I wanted to ask you, you're in a like hard realm of medicine. I would imagine you disagree with that quote, but I'm curious what you think.
I I wouldn't say I disagree with it. I think a lot of people kind of struggle with that. I think a lot of people in their early career are more sympathetic, or they're there to kind of help people. And then kind of throughout years of practice, you kind of get beaten down by the system and just, how people interact with you. I think a lot of people kind of question that. I think a lot of people get hard as they kind of go through their career and they wonder like, oh, was I a better doctor at this time? I think a doctor is I think someone who's completely sympathetic to the patient and only wants to make the patient happy is not a good doctor. I would not go see that person. Now, I would go to see somebody who's thinking about me as a medical case as objectively as possible, including a psychiatrist. So I don't see her as saying that she does think that. I think she's just kind of reflecting on um, My practice style has changed. I've become a little bit less empathetic, to maybe not empathetic, but less sympathetic to patients. I'm able to empathize with them, but I'm not going to feel those things. And it's
Yeah.
unsustainable to feel those things with a patient for 20 years. I mean, you would get depressed and burnt out. So
Yeah.
that's kind of my interpretation of it. Quickly, just touching on Dr. Lemke as a person, she is like crazy successful. She is like an incredible doctor. So just to specify what she is, she's a psychiatrist. So she's a physician who then does therapy and psychiatry with patients. She's also, and so that's kind of her day job. She's
Mhm.
also the medical director of the Stanford Addiction Medicine Clinic. So she's the absolute top person of everyone at Stanford, which is a very high functioning health system, their entire addiction program. She's also the program director for their fellowship. So everyone who's training to become addiction specialists, all the physicians who are training, she's like their boss. That alone is a single person's job.
Wow.
My program directors, that is their job.
Have
And
you
she's
ever
also
seen
and
someone that's
one more thing. She's
yeah.
also the chief of the dual diagnosis clinic. So and she's also the leader of this other clinic. And that clinic is super complicated. It's dual diagnosis. So it means somebody has like a psychiatric disorder like depression or anxiety or bipolar disorder, and they have something else, which makes treatment super complicated. So they have addiction and bipolar, or they have bipolar and general anxiety, which no, like it's super hard to treat those kind of things. So she has like all these jobs, and she still publishes this book. And I was aware of her because she's really a strong proponent of public health and kind of disseminating healthcare information. So she does a really good job too, going on podcasts and going on Netflix documentaries and stuff. So she is like this amazing person. If I
Wow.
was a psychiatry resident, I would do anything I could to go to this fellowship and like train under her.
That is awesome. Yeah, thank you for that background. I did not know that. That's insanely impressive. Um, Looking back, it's funny to kind of compare her to James Clear, right? You know, in in a book, you have like there's like kind of three argument basis. It's ethos, pathos, logos. Logos is logic. I think James Clear had a lot of logic in his book, right? Um, but then you have pathos, which is credibility, and or is it ethos? I think either way, you have credibility, right? And she blows him, I think, completely out of the water, obviously, with those accolades. And then also emotion too. I found this book to be way more emotionally resonating than Atomic Habits. So, uh, yeah, it's just funny to see all those accolades, and you might think that person would have a harder time relaying this information in like a non-medical sense, but never been in medicine. I'm a dumbass, and I think I got it pretty well. So it was cool to see.
Yeah, I think that's another good point. She's an incredible writer. I mean, this was so easy to go through, and it was really emotional and really pulling, and there were some really technical aspects. But she's also an incredible writer. Yeah,
Yeah,
very, very impressed by her. Yeah,
we love you, Anna. Come on, come on the show.
yeah.
Yeah, definitely worth your time. Cool. Let's see here. Oh, I guess last thing I kind of want to touch on for chapter one. A big part of a lot of people's kind of addiction timelines is this concept of a double life. When did your double life begin? When you start lying about maybe not even your drug use yet, but you start lying about small things. There's kind of cascades into lying about drug use and worse things. I thought personally, like, when did Caden's double life begin? Um, and I remember, at least with drugs, really specifically, back when I was maybe 12 years old. I was on the trampoline with a buddy, and his older brother got us alcohol, and we're drinking vodka on the tramp at 12 years old. And that's obviously something I was not going to share with my parents. And I'm sure I'd lied to them before, but never was it about substances. And that kind of was the start point for literally decades of lying about substances. So looking back, I remember thinking like that's kind of when my double life, I'd say, began in terms of substances, and probably a lot more formative than I would have thought back then. So
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting to think about when the double life starts and at what age too. I think that puts you at severe risk for addiction later on in life. If you consume alcohol before 16 years old, I think it's like 50 to 60% of those people end up developing alcohol addiction. And if you wait until you're 21, it's less than 10%, which is
Wow.
still very high. But regardless, point being that, earlier consumption certainly is a kind of a risk factor for addiction later on. Kind of another
Absolutely.
risk factor that they bring up is access to a drug. One of the biggest risk factors for getting addicted to any drug is easy access to that drug. I guess I just repeated it, but that's her words specifically. I guess this is something that I've kind of changed my mind on, or I've seen a lot in my own life, access leading to addiction, but then also in the literature, this link is super clear. And I think like every young man is like libertarian. I think it makes sense to a lot of young people who haven't really seen the world and don't really understand, the complexities of things. Um, and so when I was younger, I thought, oh, I mean, all drugs should be legal. I mean, people should be able to access them and make these decisions themselves. And certainly, as I've aged, I've certainly changed my opinion on that. I think maybe one of the strongest kind of examples of that was when I was in at Hopkins. There was a one of the big professors there was a super strong proponent of taxing alcohol. And alcohol, like the tax in Baltimore is the highest in anywhere in the nation. And each time he's been able to successfully increase the tax on alcohol, the overall consumption rates have dropped and the alcohol addiction rates have dropped. Um, and so it seems like counterintuitive, like you're going to raise it, well, people are still going to go and get it. Um, but I think it's an interesting strategy, and it does seem to work. You don't serve alcohol at the grocery store; it's only sold at liquor stores. You tax it out the wazoo. You limit the amount of time people can drink until. All those things seem to do have a significant impact on consumption rates.
That's a great point. That is really interesting. I didn't know that about Baltimore. That makes me wonder, though. It almost feels like semi like making the barrier of entry really difficult for a legal means to get it right. I guess it makes me think of like prohibition, right? Um, Alcohol use was certainly reduced quite a bit during prohibition. Um, but there were also some, pretty rough side effects in terms of, well, there's still this market, right? And now there's going to be other channels to provide that type of substance, which can lead to, more dangerous substances or organized crime and stuff like that. So I wonder if maybe just because the alcohol consumption from that particular source has gone down, maybe there's some repercussions that on a society type level are negative. So
Yeah, I mean, there are going to be repercussions. She's the first person I've ever heard argue that prohibition was a good thing. I mean, that kind of blew my mind. And after she said that, now I mean, I totally agree with her. And I've kind of looked into it a little bit more. I mean, the alcohol consumption rates in the late 1800s was crazy high. Like children were drinking like the average was like 5 beers a day or something for like someone in between like 16 and 18 years old in the United States. And
that's
that considerably dropped and even had a lag time after prohibition ended. There was like a huge lag time because then there weren't these companies that were making a ton of money. And then as prohibition ended, then they started selling beer. And then these huge conglomerates came up and they're like, oh, let's sell alcohol. And then they started flavoring the alcohol and marketing it to kids. And then as these companies, as like there's more limbic capitalism that really pushes this drug to people, then consumption rates have gone way back up. And so there was even a time after prohibition that alcohol was less consumed than it probably would have been, given no prohibition. Um, so I don't know. I've definitely changed my mind on prohibition of. I mean, yeah, alcohol is a terrible, terrible drug, and other things too. I mean, marijuana should it really be legal? What is the real benefit that we're getting out of it outside of just taxes?
yeah.
Maybe that's a conversation for a different time.
Yeah, yeah,
We're
yeah.
still on chapter
Some
one.
dope
Yeah,
music, brother. That's what you get out of it. Yeah, that's a good point. That's Yeah, definitely interesting. I mean, you have some countries that really take this to an extreme level, like China, for example, right? They're doing a lot of restrictions on like video games for children, um, which yeah, I mean is it's something you struggle with, right? Because yeah, like you like the concept of like, yeah, I should have independence to do what I want, even if it's something bad. I definitely used to think that a lot too. To your point, like I used to think that even though it should be illegal to not buckle your child's seatbelt, it shouldn't matter if you don't buckle yours, right? Even though that's just objectively the right thing to do. Um, I think as I've gotten older, it's just realizing how vulnerable people are to just different terrible habits and substances. Unfortunately, I don't
Yeah.
want to say humans are weak, but they're definitely vulnerable in that regard. So it's just being aware of that.
And people's whole job is to kind of manipulate those vulnerabilities, find out
Mhm.
exactly what molecule drives the most dopamine when you taste it, and then put that in a soda. I mean, there's whole food industry built around that, a whole pharmaceutical industry built around that, a whole advertising. I mean, it's all built around that, and so the methods they have are extremely sophisticated.
Oh yeah, unbelievably sophisticated, and so like the data behind it just makes it so intense. I remember when I was media buying, it's just like buying a little tiny bit of ad space, right? And it's like a singular image, and then someone would click on it, and it takes them to like a raffle type page where they'd have to put their information in. So it basically just farms people's emails and phone numbers, right? But yeah, I mean, you had backlog data of competitors and what you did months prior. So you've literally built this campaign that is so optimized to make someone click on something to try and win a raffle. And to your point, that transcends to every single market out there. It's terrifying for sure.
Yeah,
Um,
the big data is only going to make that worse.
absolutely.
But I don't have anything else for one, and I'm nothing for two. So you lead it from here.
Cool. Okay. Chapter two. So this is kind of running from the pain, and that's why a lot of people do turn to substances or social media or any type of dopamine habit. There's a quote where she is talking about a patient that comes in, and she said, "I found myself thinking he won't last, but I've learned my powers of prognostication are unreliable." I first like that comment and that quote from her. That's a pretty good point of vulnerability and her kind of building this preconceived notion of this individual in her head. And that's just human nature. But for her to realize that she made that judgment and it was false. I have felt that, especially in rehab, where you'll see someone who really looks like they're going through the steps correctly, and they are probably. There's some genuine healing being done, and then you find out, once they get out of rehab, that they're right back to where they were, and that sucks to hear. But then it's also interesting to hear about people that got into the house, and you're like, dude, this fucking person's gonna leave in the middle of the night. They're like, shaking. They're not being social. Like this person is doomed. I remember thinking that about a few people. And then I go to hear from the house manager that they graduated and they found a sober living and they found a job. So I think it's good to remember that judgments are kind of survival nature, but with something as complex as a human, very often are they wrong, and don't let that cloud you from what the result could be.
Yeah, that's a good point. Don't judge a book by its cover.
Yeah, exactly. um Let me see if there's anything else I want to talk about. One quote, just to end on chapter two, and we can move on to three. The reason we're all so miserable may be because we are working so hard to avoid being miserable. Um, if I had maybe five quotes total from the book, that's certainly one I would pick. I think that's a great point, and that describes humans on every scale, right? From shooting heroin on the streets to deciding to check Instagram for an extra minute. That's a really good way to put it.
I mean, it seems almost like a cultural thing that you should chase pleasure. You should do things that are pleasurable to you. Uh, pain is a vital sign and you should treat it if you have pain. Obviously, we know that isn't true, but that was kind of ingrained in our culture, and then I think led into medicine, which then definitely promoted the opioid pandemic or endemic. Um, yeah, I wonder how in like more ancient times, or even like just in kind of early U.S. history, if that was such a focus of people's life when they were kind of more focused on just kind of the activities of daily living and making sure they have food to survive.
Yeah.
I mean, one of
This,
the just the food aspect is just now there's so much snacking, and I was just reading the other day that snacking really didn't exist until the 70s. You would have you would essentially have 3 meals a day or big meals a day, and you wouldn't be eating in between. But now there's such a focus, like, oh, you're leaving the house, make sure you bring a snack. Make sure it's a snack you enjoy. Like, hey, little Timmy, like, is that like, do you like the carrots? If not, you can have this other Lunchables thing. I mean, I think it's such a focus on pleasure.
Absolutely. And not even like earlier times, but other countries, right, where snacking isn't as much of a focus. I know, like, if you look at obesity rates in like Japan, for example, much lower. They don't have that kind of snacking habit that America does have. Um, so yeah, it's definitely a good point. Um, okay. So if we want to move on to chapter 3, talking a little bit about the pleasure pain balance. In this chapter, it starts having some of the visuals that I really appreciate. We both appreciate visuals, I think, in any book. Um, it, yeah, definitely helps reinforce some of these words and text. So yeah, here it is. Um, you were given modern day and age. I mean, those are great examples: porn, shopping, gaming, all this type of stuff, external ways to receive pleasure. And so the concept is, our brain wants to find equilibrium, right? So as we overload this side of the seesaw with these external sources of dopamine, these little gremlins are going to try and get equilibrium in our brain. So then they're going to push down on that pain seesaw and keep doing it with more and more force. I mean, this is a good visual. It's like his buddies helping him up, and there's more like get waiting in line. That's super accurate. I think is time goes on. Um, when you first discover like porn, for example, I mean, it's a lot more powerful than the 200th time that you've watched it, or chocolate, or drugs, especially, right? Um, so yeah, I like this visual. What are your thoughts?
I think it's a really simplistic way of understanding it. Simplistic in a good way. That your body knows that you need similar amounts of pleasure and pain, and too much of one thing, it's gonna uh, kind of add something to the other side to equal it out. So yeah, this makes a lot of sense to me. And then to the point you're talking about, when you are really kind of hammering on that dopamine side, watching a lot of pornography or doing a drug a lot of times, then your body reverses and it kind of builds up the kind of the pain side a lot more. Specifically, kind of an opioid example is opioid induced hyperalgesia, which is chronic pain that gets a lot worse than it would be normally because you're chronically taking opioids, which is why nobody should be on chronic opioids, because it's actively making their lower back pain or whatever the reason why they were prescribed it in the first place. It's actively making it worse by constantly being on it.
Yeah, that's a good example. Yeah, personal one for me is like just bender of, let's say I'm doing coke for the last 24 hours. When I'm on that come down, right? Those however many hours it is. I mean, there could have been someone that just handed me $1 million, and I still wouldn't have found joy. There was literally nothing in my life where was able to find joy in. So I just lay in bed and ruminate on all of my poor decisions. And I'm literally, that person in the bottom image. Um, Now it's just so over the scales, it's impossible to balance them, at least for that time being, right? um the good news is that over time you can change it, but in that moment literally nothing can help, and that's what's like really really frustrating and miserable about it.
Yeah, that's sad.
um One quote, I thought that was another great simplistic way of kind of talking about this example. um was, this isn't from her, this was from I think a different psychologist, but we are cacti in a rainforest. That's an awesome, simple way of looking at it. We just get so much rain nowadays to our detriment. And if cacti get too much rain, they perish.
Yeah, I underlined that too. I thought that was really profound. We're over engineering our demise here. Um, we're creating drugs that are so strong and so accessible, and before you had to chew on a cocoa leaf to get a little bit of cocaine high. Now we have it. You can just like mainline it. You can just snort it, or you can just inject it and get a huge high from it. And then it's a little bit hard to get because it's a legal substance. And so now we have designer drugs that are essentially cocaine, but longer acting, and you can get them from China or India just right to your door. Yeah, I certainly do feel like we are cacti in rainforests. Um,
Mhm.
yeah,
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, it's only going to get worse, right? Unfortunately, um, in this example, the storm is not subsiding, and it's only going to get heavier. We're only going to get more and more rain. So um, it's pointless to try and hope for an environment where you're in a desert. Unfortunately, in the world we live in, that's not going to happen. Um, I think it's like, what can you do that's in your power? Can you maybe create a little umbrella that blocks some of that, right? Because we are only going to get wetter and wetter in this rainforest if we're not careful.
yeah, totally. I mean, I think that's the downside of technology, and AI will certainly kind of just in a logarithmic fashion increase this. We better understand what drives that dopamine response and just the way the world works. It's generated by generating money. And so there's going to be things that are pushed to us and advertised to us, and boundaries taken away that make that super accessible. So I think that's a great point, is that I think we need to find our own way of making a little pseudo desert, putting an umbrella or moving a little around or making a canal. I mean, it doesn't really matter the analogy for the cactus, but
You get
and
it.
then
Yeah, yeah,
to that
exactly.
point, then listening to people, because not everyone is going to be addicted to a substance, but we're all struggling with addiction to certain things to some degree, and social media is a great example of that, kind of how it's completely available to all children. And so kind of, yeah, to our point earlier, kind of listening to the wisdom of people who have been dealing with addiction. She finishes this chapter, and this chapter is the end of kind of the first part of the book, so I thought it was a really nice way of ending it. But who better to teach us how to avoid compulsive overconsumption than the most vulnerable to it, those struggling with addiction, shunned for millennia across cultures um, as parasites, pariahs, purveyors of moral turpitude? People with addiction have evolved a wisdom perfectly suited to the age we live in now. So it's kind of like science. One of the adverse effects of that is that we're in this dopamine rainforest. But then one of the hidden side effects of people who have been dealing with addiction is that they have all these things they've already been working on. They have a framework to approach life with, and avoid these things. And so there's so much we can learn from them, and they can share that with the rest of society. So yeah,
Absolutely.
I really like that.
Me too. That's an amazing point. And you see, you'll talk to a lot of people in like an AA program, and they'll be like, well, my sister who was addicted to food was able to see like kind of the steps I took, and she was able to change her life. That's so common to see. And yeah, it's great to have people that have that understanding, for sure. I love that. Um, cool. So yeah, self binding. This is chapter 4. Um, let's see. Oh yeah, yeah. High dope. So this is a quote from her. High dopamine clouds are understanding of cause and effect. That is great and very true. I've noticed in my personal life. Um, I had always convinced myself, like, let's say I'm just getting high and smoking pot, 1 p.m. on an afternoon, um, that it's only, for a little bit. And yeah, I might not get the work I need to get done. And yeah, I might order DoorDash. And yeah, I might cancel a social event. Um, but Caden tomorrow is going to more than make up for it. He's going to wake up at 5:30 a.m. and he's going to, get all of this shit done, right? Um, and that typically didn't happen. It did sometimes, and I would get myself to do that, but a lot of the time I'd wake up at that 5:30 time I was supposed to, snooze my alarm clock, end up getting up at 10 and repeat the cycle over and over. Um, and being in that dopamine rich environment, I think did really cloud my judgment on this is really affecting you in a negative way. Um, so
Yeah, I liked that idea that you really can't have a perspective on the drug of your choice, and that might not be a drug, that might be an activity, when you're doing it. And so you need an abstinence time to really clear your brain of that. And one quick point is that you can't just replace it with something else. You can't replace that with watching pornography a bunch of times per day. You have to really have a kind of a dopamine fast. I guess I thought that was one thing I was hoping to get a little more on, that is kind of how to avoid that from a non like substance addicted perspective. And she didn't really touch on that, but yeah, I like that point a lot. I guess a question to you: did you see kind of the harm in your substance use when you were in it, and then compared to when you were sober, for or even today? Like, does it seem different? Does that kind of gravity of what was happening seem different than in the time?
100%. The gravity is night and day. Um, so much so when I was drinking, and I'm sure I've told you this before, I would always tell my friends, I'm like, the most social Caden is the Caden that's like 3 or 4 drinks in. And so I would even convince myself that sometimes it would be a benefit. I remember telling a buddy of mine when we were at the same job together, I was doing blow in the bathroom, right? And my performance in the short term probably was a little bit better. And so I fixated on that so much, being like, hey, like, how bad can this really be if I'm performing so much better and in the few days? And it's funny to just see how delusional that mindset is, looking back on it, because I would look at one tiny outcome for the span of one day and correlate that to this is overall a good thing to keep on doing. Um, and a lot of people do that too. I will say though, with the more intense shit like meth, I don't think I ever did it and thought it was like a benefit. I definitely didn't think the negatives were as bad as they were, and I would always convince myself it I could avoid it. It, I could always convince myself that the outcome would be different this time if I just did it this type of way, right? I'd had a psychotic episode before. I think any sane person would understand. That's obviously a reason to never get close to a substance like that again. But in that state where I'm drunk as fuck, I'm now high on cocaine. I've convinced myself where, well, if I do it this particular way, the outcome will be different. So to kind of rant on that question, yes, my mindset is completely different today than it was back then. I really do see the cause and effect of that type of use. And there's a beauty to it. It makes it, I think, a lot easier as time goes on to continue living the life of sobriety, because it's so obvious, right? In hindsight, the effect that that kind of shit had. Um, and it builds confidence. Like, I think I'm, pretty social sober. I don't think I need 3 or 5 drinks to be my most social self anymore. Um, I don't think I need cocaine to do a good job with work. Whereas maybe I did think that before. So yeah, I appreciate asking that question. That's definitely where I stand on it.
Yeah, I mean, that's super fascinating. And I mean, I imagine it even clouds your judgment more if you're using the drug consistently. And just so we're understanding, did you use kind of consistently, or did you kind of use kind of sporadically here and there?
Yeah, so alcohol, I had used consistently in college. There were points where I drank every single night. The last, let's say, year or so, though, I drank alcohol probably two blackouts state, twice, maybe 3 times a week. Cocaine would then be, once a month. And then methamphetamine use would be maybe once every 3 or 4 months. So it's kind of like this step ladder, right? Where I could convince myself that drinking is not that bad. I do it all the time. So I drink. And then the second I put a drink in my system, the odds of me doing cocaine have gone from 0% to 20%, statistically. And the second I then do blow and I get that in my system and I've done a shit ton of that, the odds of me doing methamphetamine have now gone from 0% to 20%. Um, so I was fortunate going into rehab that I wasn't chemically addicted to anything. Because when you see people that are coming off like fentanyl, they have to go to detox. That is a whole different kind of hell. And I really empathize and or I guess sympathize with those people. Um, because it's a whole different type of battle you're trying to fight. You have this chemical addiction, whereas I had just this impulse problem, right? And I didn't realize that uh, what I had to do is just completely stop it at the entry point, which was alcohol. You know, and I have to do that for the rest of my life. Um, it's a good realization to get to, but um,
What's really
yeah,
interesting because I'm thinking about this kind of dopamine clouding your insight into the impact of the negative consequences of it. Um, and really the high dopamine releasing things you weren't using consistently. The alcohol, which does increase it, but not near as much as the cocaine and the methamphetamine. And so even when you are not using it consistently, you're still kind of clouded by that, even if the last time you used was months ago. And so then to think then somebody who's kind of consistently using a drug like an opioid where they need it every single day. I mean, I just can't imagine how clouded their insight is into their drug use and the consequences that it's having. But it is a good reminder that just enjoying a drug one weekend on a bachelor party at Vegas could have negative effects and kind of cloud
great
future
point.
judgment later.
Great point. A tiny last little anecdote personally was this last January was when I had this like psychotic breakdown from methamphetamine, and basically had to reach out to people and make them aware. I didn't go to rehab, but I basically made this pact where I was like, okay, I'm not going to do any hard substances, like no cocaine, nothing like that for the year. I still drank and I still smoked weed, but I held true to that until a Hawaii trip that I went on. And we were out clubbing that night, and someone had cocaine. And in my head, I'm like, fuck it. I'm on vacation. I've gone now like 6 months without doing, any hard substances. So it's okay. And, I'm pretty sure if I had the discipline at that time to say no to that line, I maybe would not have cascaded into, everything else that happened. The problem that I had to is with myself, and the realization I had to get to was it's not a decision once I'm that drunk. It's not. The time I have the power to make a decision is right now before that first drink, unfortunately. Because there is an allergy, right? And I can't just have one. I have to have 15 drinks. And when I'm 15 drinks deep, it's not a decision. It is a desire that I'm going to try and get fulfilled. So, yeah.
It's a cue, then or a craving, which leads to a cue, which leads to
Response and then reward.
the action. Yeah, it's a kind of predefined thing. I mean, she talks a little earlier about like a hippocampal tattoo, which I love. It's basically the hippocampus is part of the brain where the limbic system is, but you have this tattoo on your brain that you may have forever. That kind of once you get that cue, like you have that craving stronger than you would kind of if you didn't have that tattoo.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. One kind of interesting thing, she broke down dopamine as an acronym for like kind of the steps, right, of kind of understanding what your addiction is and so forth. Um, D is data, O is objective, P is problems, and then A is abstinence. I would say, and I think she'd probably agree with this. I like this acronym, but in order to collect data accurately, to set correct objectives, ones that are healthy, and to really understand the problem, all three of those things absolutely have to be predicated by abstinence. You can't be, I think, smoking a shit ton of weed, collecting data on it, and setting objectives while you're still in this state. It has to start with abstinence. So that's one small adjustment I think I'd make to this.
A dopamine, the Caden version.
Exactly. A dopamine. Yeah. I love that.
I mean, the thing I really liked about this is she was talking about mindfulness, and this is one thing we've kind of reflected on before. Um, is just this idea of mindfulness and meditation and about looking at yourself and the thoughts that come up and not being judgmental about them. So seeing sometimes in yourself like, oh, I'm craving a drink. That alone is that's not malicious or bad or something you should be ashamed about. That's just, something that a thought comes up and that's normal. The brain can do some pretty weird things, some of which are embarrassing, hence the need for being without judgment. Reserving judgment is important to the practice of mindfulness because as soon as we start condemning what our brain is doing, ew, why would I be thinking that? I'm a loser, I'm a freak. We stop being able to observe. And this observation part, this mindfulness part is super important for kind of understanding our triggers, but then also the impact that a certain activity can have on our life. So
Mhm.
this is something that I'm not great at, mindfulness and meditation, and something I've been trying to think about. And we've talked about this in the other books, but kind of seeing thoughts as waves coming in, and that's all they are. They're waves coming in, and they're going to break, and they're going to pass, and then there's going to be a new thought that comes, and all they are thoughts coming, and your identity, your ego is not tied to those things. You're just watching those from afar. So I yeah, that really spoke to me, even kind of outside of the addiction realm, but as a way of being mindful and reflecting on kind of past actions.
I love that, man. I think you could provide a lot of insight to like a group session in rehab. That example is great. I wonder where you came up with that, you kook. But um,
A
it,
barrel, an
yeah,
A-frame,
yeah,
A-frame. I can get inside.
yeah, yeah. But that was something brought up almost immediately at the start of group in rehab, where you would hear someone who has an addiction, and they would, with good intentions, talk to their therapist, and they'd be like, "When I think about it, I just like stop thinking about it, and I cut it out right then and there because like that's a bad thought to have." And the counselor, who's amazing, amazing woman, was like, "No, like you shouldn't do that. Let that feeling come in and embrace it in a sense." And it is scary, right? To like get that craving, and instead of blocking it out and like pulling my phone out, you like think about it, right? And there's some risk tied to that, right? You get that craving. If you and think about it a little bit, it can maybe turn into an obsession. But her point was similar to yours with that mindfulness. If you just treat it like a wave, you get into this habit of not, because you're gonna have thoughts like that the rest of your life. You cannot have that kind of battle every 10 fucking minutes, right? It's not
Sustainable.
sustainable.
Yeah.
Exactly. You will relapse if that's your way of defending against it. So yeah, it has to come on like a wave and just come on back, right? You just be very, very mindful. It's a great point.
I love the idea that you embrace it because it's like I never want to get robbed. And so anytime I'm in a situation where someone's robbing me, I'm just gonna like get away from it. Well, sometimes you can't. Sometimes you're gonna have to fight. So you might as well like learn how to fight, like learn the skills to get out of the situation. Um, and not just assume that you can immediately get out because it's going to prepare you for eventually you are going to be a time when you get the craving and you're at home with no accountability and you have an opportunity to do something you shouldn't and it's going to take more than just willpower to change your mind thought your yeah what you're thinking about.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. That's where discipline steps in. That's absolutely. Um, let's see. Oh, well, I love my last little piece for this chapter. This is arguably maybe my favorite point that she's made in this entire book. And this was something that wasn't touched up in rehab at all, and I definitely think it should be. Um, she was talking about with substances, what is the solution? Abstinence, right? Never do another line of coke, never smoke meth. Her point was, what about some of these addictions that you really just can't completely quit? Someone who is addicted to their smartphone, in order to be, a functioning member of today's society, you have to be able to send texts and call people, or someone that's addicted to food, right? You need food for sustenance. So she was making an awesome point that I'd never heard, which was abstinence with an addiction is a blessing. You are blessed to be capable to abstain completely, because a lot of people have these problems and they still need to somehow find a way to incorporate this particular habit or this particular food substance into their life without overindulging. If you went to me and you said, Caden, for every day for the rest of your life, you have to do one line of cocaine, just one, but you have a mountain right next to you, there is a 0% chance I don't become an addict. I 100% fucking would, right? So it's the beauty of abstinence is like that it is such a gift that I can just completely abstain from something like that. Where someone who's addicted to food, that's got to be tricky. Really does.
That, yeah, I did not pick up on that when I read this, but that is a super interesting point. And a really kind of thoughtful way of thinking about your addiction. That you're thankful that it's not that way. But it does put in perspective, gives you a little more sympathy for people who are addicted to food, to sex, to stuff that kind of our daily living experiences.
Yep, absolutely. Um, cool. That's I think all I have. Oh, real quick on the trading addiction for addiction. That's a super big issue, I think, with AA, right? And is nicotine as bad as cocaine or methamphetamine? Absolutely not. But it's still a pretty bad substance for you, right? And can lead to lung cancer and whatnot. It is kind of sad to see that the culture with all of these groups is excessive nicotine use. There'll be people up on a podium and you can tell like they haven't had their, every 15-minute cigarette. So that is something, it's tricky, right? It's obviously better for them, but in a perfect world, you'd really like to find a way to like remove that and get them addicted to something that like is genuinely good for you, like exercise, right? It's just a lot harder, a lot fucking harder.
Yeah, or not addicted to anything. I mean, not using a addictive component to kind of self-soothe.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, going on the next chapter. I mean, one of the kind of first things that jumps to me is talking about self-binding as a way of kind of preventing cravings leading to actions. And she kind of categorizes them into three different categories: physical strategies, like giving space in between you and the substance; chronological strategies, so making sure there's delayed time between the craving and when you could access it; or categorical strategies, like meaning. I guess I'm having a hard time remembering what exactly that meant, but I like the idea of kind of breaking down the self binding into these different categories to think about when you're thinking through strategies.
I agree. This chapter reminded me a bit of Atomic Habits, where it's talking about setting up those barriers to make things more difficult. I maybe spoke about this before, so I'll keep it brief. But a huge one for me with nicotine, quitting nicotine, was not having anything around me for the first like week or two. I knew if I had like a little vape next to me, I absolutely was going to hit it. So for the first week or two that I quit, I could not have a vape in the house. And then from there, right, you can kind of remove those barriers once you get a little bit more disciplined. There could be a vape right here in front of me now, and I know I wouldn't hit it. But that's not the case early on. So that's a point I definitely saw correlated to Atomic Habits. This was kind of an interesting study that she brought up in this chapter. Was uh, they were asking a control and then a group of drug users to finish this sentence about like this person's future, and it was kind of vague. It was like this person has done this and their future plans are this far away, right? And when they asked the control, the control group made it on an average 4.7 years away, whatever that was. Maybe they got a new car or they got married and had kids, but it was always, not always, but on average 4.7 years away. When they asked a drug user, it was on average 9 days away. So I think that's really fascinating just to see that the instant gratification really like personified in this data, where it's just become so obsessive with when am I going to get my next hit? What's the next day going to look like? I'm not even thinking about a decade from now. Like that's not even, I'll probably be fucking dead by then. Right. So I like that study quite a bit.
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting. I mean, to your point earlier about how you're kind of stealing from tomorrow just for today. I mean, that's an example of not even kind of thinking into the future one day, just thinking right now.
Exactly. Yep. Let's see. Anything else? Oh, you touched up on this a little bit about just like the markets and just how optimized they're getting. Just market shifts can make it difficult for us to self bind. Like for example, her piece she writes about in this chapter is gluten free food, and how at first people that were trying to avoid gluten could turn to these like pretty healthy alternatives. But because so many people got into that mindset, there was a need to fill, which was basically processed, unhealthy, gluten free food. So now that self binding mechanism doesn't work anymore. Um, and so it's scary, but it is just reminding us of how important our own like self binding has to be like internally, I guess, and not reliant on what the market is doing. Right.
Yeah, yeah. It's not as simple as like I'm just going to eat gluten free for the rest of my life, and then I don't need to think about it because then, yeah, there's financial interests that are going to manipulate that. So it's more of like a constant like thinking, like, okay, what's my self binding strategy for the next 3 months? Gluten worked last time, but now that's all taken over. Maybe I'll do keto. You know, in 3 months, that's definitely going to get saturated with healthy foods, and so then you got to think about something else.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's why I like the self-binding kind of categories. It really kind of provides a framework for it.
Totally.
One thing she kind of randomly throws in here as like a risk factor for addiction, and this makes a ton of sense to me. And when I read this, I thought about you. Like this defines you, in my opinion. The addicts are bored or frustrated problem solvers who instinctively contrive Houdini-like situations from which to disentangle themselves when no other challenge happens to present itself. Like, think about you in high school. That was totally you. You were too smart for high school. You were bored in your classes. And so you came up with these crazy situations to be in to like have to disentangle like with your parents and these sketchy situations. And same thing in college. College was too easy. And you probably went a little too soon and maybe didn't have, you know, the age maturity, but it was also too easy for you. And I think then you kind of made it more difficult with these substances. And I think there are a lot of addicts that are like that. Obviously, not everybody, but there are really high performing, high IQ people that fall to addiction.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I appreciate that. I think the really big piece of that was just, yeah, boredom. Right. Was it because of excelling in, academics? That might be a part of it, but it was really just, yeah, being bored in my environment. And I think that's a great point. Like with Horizon, especially, I remember, yeah, just being so bored with schooling that like the excitement in my life was like how much I could get away with in terms of substance abuse with my parents. So it went from like as a kid, um, this kind of maybe potentially survival instinct of, as a kid, maybe I felt like there were some points where I did have to lie, to where it was kind of enjoyable, and it progressed, worse and worse. And in college, I talked a little bit about how I lied for an entire semester's worth of my grades. Um, so yeah, I do think that describes me somewhat well. And yeah, definitely. It's funny the people you see, yeah, in rehab. It's really always a similar story. They get bored, whatever position they're in, they get fucking bored, and they want to spice up their life somehow.
Yeah, kind of makes you think about different kind of societal things you could do to prevent addiction. I mean, more individualized schooling is kind of the main thing that jumps out to me. I mean, my cousin had the exact same experience. Was like one of the highest scoring people on these standardized tests in the state and then kind of fell into addiction. I think also because he was bored. I think if you weren't in such a giant public school where everyone was kind of given the same curriculum, maybe things could be a little more individualized. I'm sure there's better ways of preventing it, but there are societal things, levers we can pull that can prevent people from kind of going down that road and feeling like that they are bored.
I 100% agree. I think the issue too is like, at least with society and alcohol, right? Like there is this glorification of like, I'm bored and I drink. And if there was some type of like shame behind like drinking in college, it was like, oh damn, like you drank too much to black out tonight. Like that's something you should be ashamed of, right? But that wasn't the case in college. It was like, dude, you had more shots than any of us. Like that was fucking gnarly. So it definitely reinforced that type of behavior. And I'm not blaming that at all. I made my own terrible mistakes, and those are mine to own up to. But that reinforcement made it a lot easier to convince myself that like this is something maybe I'm doing as a social element than something that's really like corroding my schooling and my idea of myself.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. I think the party culture in college is something to be investigated further.
Yeah.
We got like 10 minutes left, so let's zip through kind of the high yield stuff.
Yeah. Let's see. Pursuit of pain. So yeah, this is now just talking about pursuing pain. Oh, this is something I wanted to ask you. So she talks a little bit about this study about these Japanese citizens that were outside the blast radius of Hiroshima, and ones that showed extremely low signs of radiation ended up showing longer lifespans and fewer cancer diagnoses than like someone who had experienced zero radiation. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think there is some validity there? Because I read that, I was like, wow, I'm
I
curious.
mean, probably we treat cancer with radiation, very specific radiation. So it kind of makes sense that, low dose radiation would kind of zap all those misfolded proteins and destroy any kind of precancer you had at that time. You need the right dose, not too much, not too little for it. I mean, I think that general concept makes a lot of sense, kind of leaning into pain. I mean, that's why a lot of people exercise due to mental health perspectives, or they sauna or stuff like that. That's challenging and painful, because then you're kind of pressing on that pain side, and then your pleasure side comes up, and you get that runner's high, or you get that post exercise high.
Yeah, absolutely. Sauna is a great example. Something we've been consistent with, and I can't imagine not saunaing anymore. Right? I mean, I've so much motivation to do it. I have to do it when I'm at the gym now. Thanks to you mostly. So, yeah, good habit forming. Trying to get through this. Oh, okay. She talks a little bit about how like some people who obsess like workaholics, right, and really obsessing about their work can cause like some negative detriments in terms of social life and family life and stuff like that. And as someone who had an extremely busy schedule in medical school, residency, and even now, um, like how is that something you juggle when trying to retain relationship with your girlfriend and with your family? Do you ever catch yourself sometimes being a little bit too lopsided in one way? um like how do you go about doing that when it could be very easy, I think, in your life to spend 18 hours a day on your work?
Yeah. I mean, I don't think I've found a clear solution for it. I think that's something I struggle with. Um, Part of it is that work is really hard. It's challenging. So there's not a lot of internal motivation to dedicate 18 hours to it. I've done that in the past and it's burnt me out. So
Mhm.
I don't know. It's like a constant kind of balance. Don't have too much wisdom to add there. Yeah, sorry.
No, you're good. That's honest. I like it. Appreciate it.
I mean, while you're pulling up the next thing, I think the kind of the last thing I really want to talk about is this cycle of destructive shame and how it's different than pro-social shame. And so she's talking about shame, and she's saying there's good shame and there's bad shame, and pro-social shame, that's a good shame, and that keeps society functioning in a nice way, and gives you an appropriate level of discomfort when you've done things that aren't good for the whole. But then there's destructive shame, which is unhelpful. And this is kind of the cycle that it starts. You overconsume a certain thing, a certain drug or some food, and then you have shame. That leads to lying, and that's kind of where your double life takes off. That leads to isolation from your friends, from your accountability partners, from your mentors, from your family. And how you get out of that is we're all going to have some overconsumption at some point in our lives. Then it's going to result in shame. But the most important step when that happens, the diverging point is radical honesty as opposed to lying. And when you're radically honest with yourself, and that's one thing I found really interesting, that it's to yourself, which then leads to acceptance rather than like being honest with another person, which she does talk about and is important, but it's really personal radical honesty, able to think back and examine what you've done and then accept that. And then it will lead to belonging and decreased consumption. So I found this graphic really profound and made a ton of sense to me. It just made me think so much about that book we just read, Lying by Sam Harris, that talks about this line and the importance of radical honesty.
Yeah,
What do you
absolutely.
think about that? Anything?
I love that. Yeah, this is a great graphic. To tie kind of some of this into some personal stuff, I'm meeting my sponsor weekly and currently on step 4. And not last Sunday, but the week before, he gave me some assignments to do. There's through step 4, you're kind of doing this personal inventory and like stuff you write down. And I hadn't done any of it. So fast forward to this last Sunday when I meet with him, and it was never an option to lie to him, but I did start getting like I started thinking like what kind of maybe excuses can I fabricate that make it seem a little bit more valid when at the end of the day I had time to do it and I didn't do it. Was it because I was lazy? Maybe. Was it because this is a difficult assignment? Maybe. But I had time. So I had this a mission to him. I was like, hey, I had the time to do it and I didn't do it. I apologize. You're putting time in to work this through with me, and I apologize. And it turned into this really awesome conversation where he kind of experienced something really similar getting out of rehab, where you have this kind of expectation. It's like, I'm sober now and I'm going to just like fucking conquer the world. And all this dope shit's going to happen to me, right? Like the second I get out, I'm going to be amazing. Because it's easy to tell yourself, like, all my limiting factors were just substances. Other than that, I'm like the best person in the world. When that's obviously not the case. There's so many, flaws that I have that are not involving substances. So I think it was him explaining to me, I had the same feeling of you have this really high expectation, which leads to really low serenity. And then you kind of get frozen in this step work. Um, and I just thought, if I'd like come up with an excuse and he probably could catch that that's bullshit, I'm not sure if he would have been radically honest with me about how he experienced something really similar. So that I think is a great example of kind of the lower one here. And it felt great. Um, One more I want to talk about it kind of in my childhood, which was maybe part of the reason I built this habit. I remember really specifically, I got an iPhone Touch as a child. I was maybe 11 or 12. And I didn't know what sex was at the time. So I remember searching literally sex on YouTube. And my mom opens the door and she's like, "What are you doing?" And I told her the truth. I was like, I Googled sex. I'm not really sure what it was. Um, and I just remember being like berated so much. And not only was like she disappointed in me, but like God was too, that I would, do something like that. And looking back on it, it's a little boy who's naturally interested in sex, right? But in that moment, there's just so much shame attached to that. And not only were my parents disappointed, but this entity, this deity, was also so ashamed of me. And I remember thinking, like, if I just would have told her not the truth, how painless and how much pain I could have avoided. And it's small memories like that that really remind me, like, what formed such a bad habit of my line. And not to equate all that to that, I there were many things I probably did that um, made her react that way, maybe. But that's definitely something that really sticks out. That it wasn't the positive type of pro-social shame; it was destructive shame.
Yeah, for sure. This era was too strong. So you learned your lesson that next time you're not going to be honest. You're just going to lie. That's sad and a helpful perspective, I think, for anybody to think if you are a parent or a mentor or whatever that person is that is delivering the shame that yeah, I don't know. You got to be careful with it, I guess.
Totally. Absolutely. It's just like when radical honesty comes your way, and she talks about this like as a parent, it's having radical honesty is kind of the foundation. And not that you're going to be like super nice. And if your kids make a mistake and they're honest about it, you don't have to like, just pat them on the back and be like, everything's okay. But it's turning it into something positive at the end of it. It's, hey, first off, I appreciate you being honest with me. And, this is something that's, probably not okay. And here's why. And here's a time where I made that same mistake. And this is what I learned from it. So it's turning that conversation into something like that rather than you are a piece of shit. And because of this, like you're never going to amount to anything. Right.
Yeah. Going back to your earlier example, I mean, about AA and how they have kind of the tasks to do. One thing she brings up here is that, these communities, church and AA and all these things that help support people, what makes them really effective is that they kind of charge you have to do something. There's a task, there's a requirement to kind of be involved with it. And so it kind of prevents freeloaders or people that are kind of just coming in and not really invested. And I kind of think of like, people who pay like out of pocket or cash for their healthcare are like much more likely to adhere to whatever you say rather than somebody whose insurance is just reimbursing it and they're not really investing in it themselves.
Great example.
I found that really interesting. I guess you kind of already brought it up, but one question I had for you is kind of like, in your experiences, how have they um, made a little bit of barrier to entry so that you're kind of personally invested?
Yeah, great question. Well, one pretty big thing is, let's say you're at an AA meeting and you get called on. Um, you're not allowed just to like pass and stay seated. If you want to
Oh,
pass, that's okay, but you have to get up. You have to walk to the podium. You have to say your name. You have to say what your addiction is, and then you can say, "I'm going to pass." That is a requirement. So
I didn't know
someone
that.
yeah, so someone can't just sit there and say, "I'm gonna pass." So even that alone, it's that's minor, right? Saying your name and your addiction. But I think the purpose of that is not only to help you feel like you're a part of the community, but for the community to feel more alive. And you're instantly, I mean, you can still kind of freeload, right? If you're not doing any of the work, but you're a little bit less of a freeloader. If you're willing to go up there and say your name and admit to this group of people that you are an alcoholic or you're a meth addict. So that's, I think, one pretty good example of that. Um,
That's interesting.
and the step work in itself is inherently built to make you contribute. Um, I'm up there, but I think step 12 is basically giving back and being so yeah, someone who just gives back to the community. Is that help setting up chairs, or is that helping someone else and sponsoring other people? That is a requirement before you get through the 12 steps. So those are the two that kind of point out to me. But yeah.
Yeah, well, that's really interesting.
Mhm.
Any other kind of final things to touch on before we wrap up?
Um, I don't think so. This book was, I wanted to say, I think the timing of this book was perfect for me. Coming out of rehab and into kind of this lull period in my life where I'm sober, but maybe not everything is happening as quick as I'd like or so forth. I think this was a really awesome book to dive into. Taylor, a great recommendation. I mean, I'd probably give this, shoot, I don't know, nine out of 10, probably.
Nice. Well, yeah, I mean, I thought it was really well written. I thought it was really intriguing. There were a lot of experiences she shared about her patients, and then she shared really vulnerable things about herself, which was it. It definitely helped apply the lessons. It seemed it was just very humble. It kind of made you feel close to her. I mean, it was just a very, very well written book. One of the best written books I've read. Um, I was kind of hoping there was a little more about just kind of dopamine response kind of outside of like a full on addiction when you're not necessarily addicted. I think there's a lot of subclinical addictions, or I don't know the right word, but when you're just scrolling on your phone for more than you'd like to.
Totally.
Stuff like that, that I don't think she quite touched on, and then didn't really expand on strategies to kind of address those things. And I was hoping for that. So I was a little disappointed with that.
Mhm.
I think it was a little heavy on the anecdotes as well. I mean, there were anecdotes with every single chapter, and a lot of it got kind of taken up by that, which was interesting. It kind of made it flow, but I would have liked a little more kind of substance or so I mean, it started. I probably would have said the same thing, like 9 out of 10. This is an amazing book. But then as it kind of went on, or as it finalized, I guess I was hoping there was going to be a little bit more. So I was a little disappointed by that by the end. So I'd probably give it a 7 out of 10. But I would certainly recommend it to essentially anybody, because I think there's lessons in here to learn for yourself for treating addiction, for because we're all at risk of addiction at any point of our lives. That's the scary part about it, for having sympathy for people who are going through it, and then having kind of more insight into kind of the wisdom that you can derive from people who've gone through addiction. So I think anybody could benefit from reading this book, and yeah, I certainly would recommend it.
Absolutely. I mean, this was something I would easily recommend for people in rehab to read at any point. This, I think, would be so helpful to be paired with like group therapy and being in a safe environment. Um, yeah, I agree though. There was a lot of examples of a lot of patients, and you kind of get the point, right? So I see that for sure. But yeah, great book. Thanks for the suggestion. Good work. We are moving on, changing it up a bit. Let's go, Cosmos. A boy,
Book
Carl
is
Sagan.
beautiful. I'm stoked for it. What's it about?
Yeah.
Give us like a one
Uh,
liner on it.
yeah, I honestly know very little. All I know is I like Carl Sagan and I like space. So I hope I'm going to like this book. I think it's just
A
him.
quick little teaser is that Kate and I have some ink on our bodies that may be related to Carl Sagan. So maybe
Oh,
we'll
bro.
discuss that. But no, don't
Oh,
judge. We don't
okay.
know. We'll maybe discuss it.
Yeah.
Maybe.
On the OnlyFans, yeah, that's where you get to
Yeah,
see it.
yeah.
Nice.
All right. Well, any closing words, or are we wrapping it up?
I don't think so. Thanks for watching. Appreciate it. Good insight, man.
Yeah, great talking, Caden. You had a lot of profound things to say. I mean, given your experience, yeah, you got a lot of wisdom in it, and I appreciate you being so open. I mean, I learn a ton from your experience that you've shared, which is a unique one. So, thank you.
Appreciate it, man. You make it easy, to be honest. So, absolutely.
All right. Well, signing off. Until next time.
Peace.